Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'll try to be as quick as possible, but I've got two pieces to my presentation. One is just to very quickly introduce AECF, the Africa Enterprise Challenge Fund. I think that will put some context into what we do and how what we do then talks to SDG 2. In a nutshell, we work with the private sector. We work with entrepreneurs who are focused on creating development impact in the rural areas, in marginalized parts of Africa. Essentially, if I was to say it simply, we work to improve lives of the people in Africa using the private sector. We work in three different areas. We work in agribusiness, agriculture, we work in renewable energy, and we work in the climate adaptation and mitigation technologies space. Those are the three areas we look at. And we look at cross-cutting themes that then talk to what we are trying to achieve. If you're working in Africa and you don't have a gender view of things, then especially in agriculture, you've missed the point. So for us, we've got three cross-cutting themes that are critical for us. One is gender, and I'll mention later around a program we have that looks at investing in women entrepreneurs in agribusiness. We work on programs that focus on youth intervention and creating jobs for the youth and supporting youth to be entrepreneurs. And we go to places where people find it difficult to go, which is what is considered fragile or very difficult places in the continent of Africa. And that fragility is not just about political or security. You can have what may seem like a very stable country, but within that country, a lot of fragility in itself, in the rural areas especially. And we work a lot with entrepreneurs in those environments. AECF has been around for 10 years. We've worked with, so far, 268 companies across 26 countries in the continent. And what we do is, for us, critical in the sense of blending finance. We are mainly funded by public funding from more than 8 bilateral funders and 1 or 2 private foundations. But we always insist that the entrepreneurs themselves then have to leverage and also bring something to the table. So far, we've leveraged more than $750 million that the entrepreneurs themselves have put to the table based on the funding that we've provided to them. When we look at what we do, it cuts across a number of SDGs, and I'll not belabor the point that these SDGs, of course, are very connected. But our work cuts across SDG 1, 2, 5, 7, 8, and 13. Those are really the main, I would say, SDGs that the work we do impact. The private sector entrepreneurs we work with, of course, don't necessarily understand when we talk SDG language. And you don't require them to understand that necessarily. All we ask them to do, for example, is to know that the work they do is helping in improving the nutrition of the babies and children in the areas they work with. Whether they call that something else from SDG 2, that's for us is not really critical, but they understand the reason why they do it. What we try and do ourselves is we've looked at the landscape around financing in Africa, especially financing for agribusiness. And those of you who worked in the continent will understand that the toughest sector to fund and to get funding for is agribusiness because it's considered risky. It's perceived to be very difficult to make money in a sustainable way. And part of our job is to make sure that we are bridging the gap that we call the missing middle. That gap essentially is between, at the very low level, you've got NGOs that do a lot of work that provide funding to people who need $500, for example. You probably get that kind of money. If you are at the top end of the scale in agribusiness in Africa and you need $20 million to do your projects, there'll be too many people fighting over to fund you. If you need $100,000 to do any agribusiness entity in Africa, you'll probably struggle quite a bit. Even if what you're doing is very profitable, even if what you're doing is very good. mainly because it's perceived to be not the right size, the transaction costs are too high, and we'd rather do the bigger deals. Okay. So we are trying to fill that gap, and we've got learning from the last 10 years on how we can address that issue. If you look at what we call the impact investment ecosystem across the continent, there are a lot of players who are small players doing slightly small deals and investing little money. And then the players who've got very large amounts of funding are always doing very large deals. So if you go to an African Development Bank, for example, their investments are 10, 20, 30, 40 million dollars. Okay. If you go to some of the impact investors are put there, the more funding they get, the larger they go in terms of scale. So there's always a missing middle piece where nobody really wants to fund because it's not necessarily economically viable to do that in the long run. So what have we done in the last 10 years? Very quickly, we've done 189 businesses across the continent. Those businesses then work with smallholder farmers and work with the communities in different ways. I'll explain very quickly. But we use a challenge fund model, which is to say we put out the challenge to the private sector and say, this is the issue you're trying to address. What can you do about it? How does your business contribute to what we're trying to do from an impact perspective? And that's the method we try and use. AECF itself uses 3 different steps in terms of the graduation. So we work with very early stage companies, and we call that our AECF core. We've got something we call AECF scale, which is to say for the companies that have gone beyond the early stage and now growing, can do a bit of more commercial funding, we help them get investors. And then we try and create a platform and connect those companies to trade among themselves and talk to each other and work with the communities as well. Across the continent, what have we done so far in terms of impact? Impacted 18 million lives. We've, in the companies we work with, there are 11,000 jobs directly in those companies, and there are hundreds of thousands of other indirect jobs that have been created. We've created close to $1.3 billion of development impact in the last 10 years, and $750 million of leveraged funding from the private sector. So what's our contribution specifically to SDG 2? And I'll be very quick in summarizing this. I'll say first, ending hunger is a very big role. So I'll break it down a little bit into the 3 things that we look at under that. Nutrition, for example. We have companies that are in our portfolio that are producing or doing businesses that are producing products and working with communities to produce either seeds or products that talk to increased nutritional needs of the community. So if you look at a company that is a seed company, we are looking at some seed companies that are saying, how can we then have better variety of seeds that talk to nutrition in a better way? Those are examples of what we have. We are looking at companies that can provide income to the communities, either by being an aggregator. So for example, if you're living in a place where the community grows mangoes, then we would fund, for example, the company that is processing those mangoes and making sure that they provide market access to the community. And we've got an example there of Meru Greens, which is a smallholder farmer in a company that works with 10,000 smallholder farmers in Kenya, for example. We do a lot of work in resilience, and I think I'll spend just another extra minute or 2 on this one, because because this is important. But resilience for us is important. So we've got companies that are doing work around providing services on weather insurance, providing services around using solar pumps for drip irrigation, companies that are looking at new crops that can be used for drought-resistant varieties, but in dryland areas. So it's a whole host of different companies. I wouldn't be able to give it, there's not enough time to talk through that. But I just want to leave you with 3 things that I think are important. If you forget everything else I've said, please remember these 3 things. Number 1 is we need to encourage the support towards financing of the private sector if you want to talk about sustainable agriculture. There's no way we'll talk about sustainability in agriculture if the entrepreneurs are not involved. Yes, we understand there's a challenge in policy, we understand that, and that will never be perfect. But in the meantime, something needs to be done, and the entrepreneurs are ready to do that. Financing is a big challenge. Number 2, we need to get away from the mindset that agriculture somehow is risky. It is, but everything else you do in life is risky. Okay, and there are ways of mitigating that risk. So that mindset needs to change. And lastly, I would talk about the need for partnerships. There's a lot of people doing different things on the ground, and everyone is doing what they think is best, but there's need to talk to each other, and they need to have partnerships that relate to what we all are trying to achieve. Thank you.